Thanks to the competent settings menu in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, it is actually rather easy to find optimized settings for yourself, but you can also get some great insight just by comparing the PC version to PS5 to see what PS5 uses to keep its frame rate up and maintain 60 FPS as much as possible in its performance mode. The devs have already made optimized settings essentially for us, it's just that they're on PlayStation 5. Dynamic resolution scaling should be at the top of your list for optimized settings as PS5 uses it heavily. With performance mode, they are scaling down to as low as almost 500p to keep performance up as close to 60 as it possibly can. On PC, I recommend using it as well, though it does have some caveats on PC, namely with the upscaler you choose. First, on XeSS, I have not been able to get DRS to engage, as the version of XeSS seems to be an old vintage here. Secondly, DLSS works with DRS, but its bottom resolution is always 50% output axis resolution, or performance mode. So if you use FSR, it can technically go much lower in resolution when it needs to hit the targeted frame rate, which should be obvious in this side-by-side I am showing here. DLSS with DRS is recovering some of that frame rate versus the static resolution, but FSR is doing it much better because it can drive down the resolution much further than just 50% axis res. The slider I showed off earlier for minimum res only applies to FSR at the moment, unfortunately. The top resolution DRS scales to is controlled by the level of FSR or DLSS you choose, but with a limit to quality mode, essentially. FSR native AA works, but DLAA does not. Basically, there are a couple of limits on how DRS works, and the menu is not explicit enough at the moment, I would say, to let you know that those limitations are there. So hopefully they can change that in a patch to make it more flexible. For example, allowing XeSS to work with DRS by upgrading its version to the latest, and by allowing DLSS to scale based upon the resolution percentage slider. Coming to ray tracing, you have to consider two things. First is GPU. Looking at the reflections in this image, we can see that turning on reflections is not too expensive on the RTX 4060 at this res. Just 22% performance cost for getting rid of many SSR artifacts. Yet the reflections stay just as chunky as they are with SSR. Increasing the res of reflections has a significant cost over being turned off, decreasing performance by 36% there. Based upon what I showed off about RTAO earlier with its low ray distance, I find it is not necessarily worth the cost at all on a mid-range GPU, unless you're fine with low frame rates. Here I find it hard to appreciate its positive impacts versus its performance. I would say for 60 FPS targets on GPUs like the RTX 4060, ignore the RT, but if you're going for 40 or 30 FPS, then the Ultra RT reflections are great. An RTX 3080 or 4070 tier GPU can go for Ultra RT and attempt for 60 FPS as I see it, while perhaps ignoring RTAO. For CPUs, RT performance cost is also important. You're going to need better than Zen 2 as I show here, where a Ryzen 5 3600, for example, with RT enabled, will drop below 60 FPS in a number of game scenes. So if you want to attempt 60 FPS with RT on, at least have a Zen 3 or later equivalent. Your next port of call should be terrain decoration quality. As I described earlier in the video, this changes the amount of rocks, twigs, vegetation, and leaves scattered about in the more open sections of the game, and has a noticeable performance hit on Ultra, 4 to 5%, depending on the scene. Like the PS5 version, I recommend the high setting for optimized settings to make sure the open areas of the game run as best as they can. Level of detail should also be dropped down to high for a similar reason, as it offers a nice performance bump, but has far less quality loss on high than the last setting even, though mid to low setting here removes a lot of the mid to distant geometry, like these birds just hanging out over here. Curiously, this level of detail setting also affects the quality of shadows cast from trees if you notice. Look at the shadow on the ground here. It makes them partially simplified on high and lower versus ultra. Here I noticed that the PS5's performance and fidelity mode both appear to use the level of detail of high for world objects, but the fidelity mode has a custom setting where its shadows from trees use the ultra level of detail setting. So it's a mixed preset not attainable on PC. Either way, use high here for optimized settings. Since I don't recommend RTAO, which type of HBAO should you use? Well, here the full setting obviously offers more coverage and greater image contrast, but in the end, SSAO is just a hack, and it's hard to know which one is actually more physically accurate. So it's up to taste. but to keep the same settings as console, use the HBO full setting. The post-process settings control the quality of motion blur and depth of field. Zooming in, one can see how Ultra resolves better bokeh shapes than the settings below it, but at a hefty performance